used to tell us that the only reason why you learn it the first time is so that the second time you learn it is not the first time.
Yeah. What happens if the second time is the first time?
You're in trouble because the first time is the first time you're just learning to sound the words out, really.
Then the third will be your second.
That's right conclusion.
Absolutely. There's an inherent problem spoken about, I think, since very old times in lots of different works and lots of different places. There's an inherent problem with learning works. Like there's a problem with learning a book, right? Because the whole problem is that really to understand any one part of a whole, you have to have a picture of the whole. Mm-hmm. But you can't have a whole without having all the parts. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem. You can't understand the parts without the whole, and you can't understand the whole without the parts.
I'll tell you the solution.
Which is why you have to learn it many times. That's why the second time is really so that the first time isn't so that the reason you learn it the first time is so that the second time isn't the first time, right? So now you have the whole thing. You see where it goes.
I'll give you another Jewish explanation.
Yeah.
You need to read the book that Ronnie gave me, or told me. לנצח כל רגע מחדש.
Okay.
This book tells you in a very, very...
It summarizes the Tanya very nice.
Not only summarized, but it gives you like hints and focuses you on the right thing. So when you read the first time, it's already after you're aware of...
right, you can read a summary.
I'm almost done. I read it like, I couldn't even stop. It's like
I'll let you read it. That's right. It's in Hebrew.
I can't read it in Hebrew.
You can't? No.
They don't have an English.
It's not for enjoyment. Hebrew is for study. Reading is...
It's actually the same language of the study.
I understand.
It's
I'm just joking. It'll take me a very long time.
He's quoting the Tanya in some places, but he's doing that in a very understandable way.
Right. I understand. Yeah, the summary is also good. The rabbi who told me to learn many times over was not a Chassidus teacher. He taught a Shulchan Aruch.
He was saying something which I don't believe it's even written in Tanya, and this is like, God, not only wisdom, but God poured into you. He's saying that the difference between a man and every animal is our lips. We do not know how the lips are even working because, you cannot tell someone.
It is somewhere in Tanya. It's in the reason why no one knows if it's said in Tanya is because it's in the difficult parts near the end that no one reads. Mm-hmm. It's somewhere in there. It's somewhere.
You read your Gechitas and you just read it.
That's what I mean by no one reads. It's in the Geras HaKodesh. You do the same one for 5 weeks and you have no idea what it's talking about.
Yeah. But
it's one of those.
It's such an important thing in you. And you're not even aware of, and you cannot even control it.
Man is called the Medaber, right? There's a reason why in the Kabbalistic distinctions between inanimate is really called silent. It's the opposite of the Medaber, right? It's called Domim. The literal translation of Domim for inanimate objects is really the silent. They don't speak at all. And you have two intermediate categories. You have what grows, Tzemach, you have Chai, which is the animate. They move, right? You have the animals. And then in the final category you have Medaber, which refers to human beings. And the category of human beings, which you would think by all rights would be called the I guess you'd say, right, the Cheshev, right, the one who thinks, is called in Kabbalah the one who speaks. It's interesting. Even though we're set aside by our intellect, as is explained many other places in Chassidus, the actual category is called the one who speaks, not the one who thinks. Mm-hmm. The most defining feature of the human being is not that he thinks, but that he speaks. It could be read many different ways. I'm sure there's a sharp way of reading that. You can imagine different ways of reading that. Okay, I'm going to do a review. That's why I'm so relaxed.
So do we need the textbook or we're just going to...
The textbook, I don't know. It can help you. It cannot help you. I don't know. Maybe we may look at something inside. I'm not sure. I don't know. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure yet. I haven't finished the book yet, right? I'm still doing the parts. Once I do the parts, I'll have the whole. And then we'll know in retrospect what we needed. I don't think so. I don't think we're going to do inside, at least not to start with. If we finish the review, which would be a miracle, then we can maybe move forward a little bit.
Well, in order to finish, we need to start.
I'm working on it. I was hearing all these interesting things about this book and this other thing.
And there's more to come.
Our chapter that we're learning, chapter 9, is on the face of it, at the simple level, deals with a very similar question to one that we've dealt with already in these classes and in this discourse. However, as we're going to see, and really this is a perfect place to put the review, because right following this review, immediately moving forward, things are going to be a little bit different. We're going to see that it's not exactly the same. Even though, up to this point, relatively, you could say, it's fairly similar. There's probably differences. The people that are learning more carefully than we are could probably find more differences than we found. But more or less, and the Tzemach Tzedek says explicitly that it's like what it is, like we said in previous chapters, we are answering a similar question to what we've answered before. And the question is how is it possible for God to change His will? Now, the example that we give, the example is important because in various classes on this already we've gone into different diversions and things, and it's important, and it's all roughly on the same topic. But our example is good because the example grounds us. It gives us something specific to understand. Because when we start talking about what will means, there's many different levels, there's many different types of things. We can get confused. So the grounding example for the chapter is that today, right now, God does not want the Beis Hamikdash to be rebuilt. What's the proof? The Beis Hamikdash is not rebuilt, right? Because if God wants it, it would be. God does not want the Beis Hamikdash rebuilt. Now, He wants it at some level, right? Let's not misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that God doesn't want the Beis Hamikdash rebuilt. God does want the Beis Hamikdash rebuilt, but He doesn't want it to be a reality right now. If He wanted that to be the reality, this second, it would be the reality. So for whatever reason, God does not want that to be the reality right now. He wants it to come about through a different process, to come about in a different way. Whatever the explanations may be, He wants it, but what I mean by He doesn't want it is that actively, right now, He is not desiring that the Beis Hamikdash should be there, because if He was, it would be there. And yet, we pray to God every day in davening, may it be your will. We say it after, in the Chabad Nusach at least, we say it after every Shemona Esrei. We say, may it be your will that the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt. Yehi Ratzon. Yehi Ratzon literally means, may it be your will. May your will be. Right? We ask God to change His will, to change what He wants, and to want that the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt. In actuality, right now, we ask God to change His will. Now, the question is how can we ask God to change His will? There's several problems. And really, if we understand what we're really asking to change His will, we understand how this connects back to all the previous things we've spoken about with regards to the other traits of God. Because in truth, at least so far, the description of will is not fundamentally different in any way than the description of God's wisdom, His thought, His love, right? We say His reward. He rewards with kindness, and He rewards the righteous with kindness, and He punishes the wicked. We've spoken about that already. And now we have His will. And all of these things are related. What's the relationship between all of these things? These are all, in various ways, different things that God does. Right? These are different ways that God, so to speak, expresses Himself, or ways in which God is manifest. Now the problem is that manifestations of God, or attributing any definition or any limited expression to God whatsoever, is famously or infamously problematic. There's issues with it. There's issues in understanding it. There's issues in it being logical. There's issues in really making sense of it. And these issues have been issues. There have been many answers. There have been many ways of dealing with it. But these are prime issues in understanding God. And ultimately, understanding God and understanding what cannot be understood about God is the point of our discourse, which is about faith, right? Faith being the way that the soul's relationship with God beyond what it can understand. So if the soul has a relationship with God beyond the understandable, it pays to understand, to know what we can know about God and what we can't know about God. And that's basically what we've been speaking about for like 6 chapters at least, a long time in this discourse. We're talking about we're using Maimonides' 13 principles of faith as a foundation, right? Even though, as I mentioned, the first time they were brought up, they're by no means, so to speak, quote-unquote canonical, right? The 13 principles of Maimonides are argued on by other rabbis. They're controversial. This shouldn't be a principle. This should be a principle. This I believe. This I don't believe, right? But nevertheless, the basic what everyone is arguing with is the Maimonides 13 principles. In other words, that's the baseline. If you want to argue with it, if you want to say it's not this way, it's a different way, so you argue with the Rambam's principles. But these are the principles that the Rambam formulated when in the Middle Ages he thought it was good to summarize, so to speak, the orthodoxy, the correct belief of Judaism, which until then had never been codified, and until today is still a matter of some controversy, right? Judaism being more a religion of practice than solid belief, right? There's room in some sense for many different types of belief in Judaism, right? To varying degrees and in varying senses, and that's why there's arguments among the rabbis about things which you'd think would be very fundamental. And the first thing in Judaism, these are not first things. In Judaism, these come later. In Judaism, the first thing is that God gave you the Torah. This is what He expects from you. Live a life according to His desires, and that's the fundamental thing. The beliefs in everything is in some sense secondary. Although maybe Chassidus would have something to say about the nature of that being secondary. But that's a different story. So we're dealing with the Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Particularly the first 5, if I'm not mistaken, if I recall correctly, deal with God. The first 4. There's 4 or first 5? I think first 5. I think the first 5 deal with God. 6 and 7 deal with prophecy. 8 and 9 deal with Torah, if I'm remembering correctly. I may be getting all the numbers wrong. But the first few, the last 2 at least, are Mashiach. But the basic idea is that the first few are dealing with the nature of God. And they say many things about the nature of God. God is one, God is uncreated, right? God is indivisible, God does not exist within time, God has the power to do anything that He wants to do, right? He's the cause of everything and nothing causes Him, right? These are all included in the Rambam, in the principles of faith. Now the thing is that the principles of faith are controversial, and we already explained at the beginning of the Maimer that there's disagreements about what exactly faith is and what can be known, right? And the Rambam, generally speaking, taking a more philosophical approach, has a different idea of what it means to know than the more Kabbalistic approach, which has different standards, right? All of that is complicated, and that's all in the first couple of chapters of the Maimer, if you'll remember to back there. So back to this idea of will, back to this idea of ratzon, of what God desires. God's desire represents a change in Him, in at least, seems to represent a change in Him in at least one way. Now, the truth is that any expression or manifestation of God that is defined in any worldly terms has this problem potentially. It's not just will. We said the same thing about God's mind, right? God's knowledge is a problem. That was the original problem. That was the first of these that we dealt with. We say, what does it mean that God knows, right? The Rambam and the Maharal disagree. The Rambam, being Maimonides, the famous Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages and codifier of halacha of the Middle Ages, who wrote a philosophy of Judaism that integrated Islamic and through the Islamic Aristotelian philosophy and theology very famously in order to explain Judaism as tools that he used to explain the Torah Judaism in a rational fashion that was appropriate to the rational-minded Jew of his time, for what that meant in his time. The Maharal, a very different figure, lived centuries later, famous Maharal of Prague, most famously of the Golem for some reason, although even if the story of the Golem is true, it's in the larger scheme of things, it's probably one of the less relevant things that the Maharal did. Maharal wrote many svarim about Judaism. The Maharal was both a student and a practitioner of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic thought, which is really why with the Maharal, that's really the fundamental reason, as we've learned out through our discourse, why the Maharal has a problem with the Rambam, because Kabbalah and philosophy take two very different views of reality. They take different views of God. Ultimately, to summarize a very long discussion that we've already had in these classes, ultimately, the Maharal says that to define God in any worldly terms whatsoever is to ruin the absolute simplicity of God. And this includes not just affirmative worldly terms, to say that God is wise, but even the negative theology of the Rambam. The Rambam does not describe what God is. The Rambam says we can only describe what God is not. We don't say that when we say that God is wise, all we really mean by that is that He is not ignorant. He is not lacking knowledge, right? He has none of the chesronis. He has none of the privations of that our natures have. And even this, says the Maharal, is too much of a description of God, because even though you're saying God is not ignorant, or God is not lacking, you're still describing him in terms of the world. And even this act of describing God in worldly terms, even in the negative, is to define God too much. And that's not the God of Judaism, says the Maharal. The God of Judaism is utterly undefined in worldly terms, both in positive and negative terms. The Rambam holds to the negative theology. The Rambam says that we cannot say what God is, but we can at least describe him by what he is not. And by this system, by being able to describe what he is not, I am able to answer our first question, which the question is how can God think? Right? Now, here's the problem. What's the problem with God thinking? Really, there's more than one. There's multiple problems, but let's stick with the main one. What seems to me, at least in the Tzemach Tzedek, to be the basic problem. There's an additional problem on top of the basic one, maybe two. The basic problem, I shouldn't say basic. I should say fundamental. The underlying problem, because the other problems are really just, in some ways, I think, consequences of this problem. The underlying problem is that to say that there's a God and God's mind, or God's thought, is to cast a question on his unity. God himself, by definition, philosophically speaking, must be the cause of all things. He is caused by nothing, and everything is caused by him. Something which is the single cause of all things must be one. He must be of absolute unity, right? For obvious reasons, because if he's parts, right, then you have all sorts of problems. If you have parts, you have, what binds the parts into a system, first of all? Because the parts, you're considering the parts as to be two parts of one thing. So now you have one part and a second part, and then you have some sort of overriding principle or overriding system that binds them together. So why is either part the main thing? Maybe the whole system is the main thing. Not to mention that if the part needs the whole and the whole needs the part, then neither one of them is prior, right? There must be something which comes before them, which explains them, which explains where this division comes from, right? Which precedes this division. So in other words, if God has divisions, he himself, then you're not talking about God. If what you're talking about has divisions or has parts, then it can't be God, because God must be the cause of everything. And the cause of everything, if he had parts, would, to use a broad and imprecise language, would be caused by his parts, or defined by his parts, right? His parts would in some way contribute to his being. This is a major issue. God can have parts, as we've discussed at length many times. The Rambam says, you're misunderstanding what we mean when we say that God thinks, right? Or when the sages call God a chacham, when the sages call God wise. The problem with God's thought is that there's God and there's his thought. This implies parts in God. This implies a duality. There's a God and then there's God's thought. But really that's not true. Because as the Rambam points out, everything that we know about God in philosophy, we know by looking at human beings and extrapolating upwards toward God. In a human being is not defined by their intellect. You have the person, and then you have their mind. They have other faculties as well. They don't just have a mind, right? They have a body, they have a motive faculty, they can move, they can feel, right? They can speak. There's many things a person can do. A person is not defined necessarily by thinking or by their intellect entirely. There's the person, and then there's their thought. The Rambam says, if you think that is inherent to the nature of thought, you're making a mistake. That's a limitation of thought. That is to say, we are looking at what thinking is, and we're saying that thinking must be, there's the person, and then there's their thoughts. The Rambam is saying, but why make that assumption? Maybe it's only in human beings, maybe it's only in the thought with which we're familiar, as limited beings in physical bodies who do have parts, where thought has to be the person and then there's their thought. This is a limitation of thought. But if God is lacking all limitation, if God does not have parts and is not bound by a physical form, or is not bound by definition, then God and his thought can be one. God and his knowledge, God and his wisdom can be one. The distinction between the essence, the person themselves, and their thought is a lack, is a privation, is a chesaron, is something that shows that we do not think perfectly. If we could think perfectly, perhaps we and our thoughts would be absolutely one. There would be no difference between us and our thoughts. Just as the Rambam goes on to explain, there would be no difference between us and our emotions, and us and our will. These things would all be one thing. And that one thing is God. So it's not, when we say that God has wisdom, we're not saying that He has wisdom like we have wisdom. That's a category error, it's a mistake. It's to say that He thinks like we think. Why should we say that at all? God thinks in the truest, most ultimate, infinite sense. He thinks without limitation. So His thought and Him are one. He is His thought. When we talk about God's wisdom, we're simply we're putting we're assigning a human name to one aspect of one thing, and that's God. There's no two things. There's not God in His thought, there's only one thing. We're talking about one single essence. And the Rambam describes this so when we say God is wise, what are we saying? We're saying He's lacking all of the limitations that we have on our thought. We're not saying He's a being and then He has the capacity for thought as a separate capacity. That would imply multiplicity. That would imply there's two things. We're saying God, who is absolutely one, is lacking ignorance. He's lacking the limitations that we have on our knowledge. His knowledge is perfect. And in His knowledge being perfect, it's absolutely one with Him. And the Rambam says that this being, with whom His knowledge and every other capacity that He has, is absolutely unified in an absolute unity, and there's literally only one thing, this being is called God, and you cannot understand it. You can only say what it is not, you can't say what it is. The Rambam's famous formulation of this fact, that we know God through the negative and not through the positive. You can only say what He is not, and not what He is famously formulated as God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. He is the Yodea, the Yodua, and the Mada. In other words, in a human being, the knower, the human being, the knowledge, which is their capacity to think, and the known, which is the object of the thought, are all separate things. But there's no reason to apply that limitation to God. By God, He is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. They're all one thing. The one who knows, the capacity to know it, and the thing that is known is all one in God. There's no separation. There's just God. And the Rambam says this is beyond the capacity of the human mind to understand. We don't understand how this is, but that doesn't mean that we have to apply the limitations of our thought to God. Who says that God and His knowledge must be separate? We're talking about an infinite being after all, the cause of all that is. When He knows, He doesn't know like we know. His thoughts are not our thoughts. His way of knowing is an infinite way, and His knowledge is totally unified with His very being. That's the Rambam's solution to how God knows. The Maharal comes and says, no. The Maharal says, you say that God's essence, God's very being itself, knows? In other words, even though the Rambam is not defining it, he's not saying what that knowledge is. He's only saying what it's not, right? He's only saying God is lacking ignorance. Nevertheless, the Maharal says, ultimately you're saying that God Himself and His knowledge of anything are the same thing. God and knowledge are at the same level, says the Maharal. You're saying ultimately that God is a being of intellect. Not a being of intellect like human intellect. The Rambam doesn't say he's like human intellect. He's a being of intellect, divine intellect, not in a way that human beings can understand. Right? God transcends human knowledge. But even this being who transcends human knowledge, even though you only know Him in the negative way, even though you only know Him by saying what He's not, that itself is a limitation on God. This itself is to say that God and His knowledge of the world and the knowledge of everything that He knows are so to speak, at the same level. They share a plane. God and His knowledge of the world are synonymous. They're the same. And the Maharal says, God forbid to say such a thing. God ultimately transcends His knowledge. You're lowering God down. You're lowering Him down into intellectual terms. God is absolutely simple. He's not a being of knowledge. He's not a being of anything. He's a being only of Himself. He is a being only of God. That's it. There's no description. That's it. He's a being of God or godliness, says the Maharal. God is God, so to speak. Now, the problem with the Maharal, as we also explained previously in the lesson, somebody maybe want to open a door or something? Is anyone else hot?
Stuffy?
Nachon. Is everyone roughly with me so far?
Yes.
All right.
Yep. The summary is very accurate.
That's good. Thank you. So,
Just open the door a little bit, yeah. And put the wedge.
In between, maybe you can look at the moon.
all right.
Sit on the moon.
The problem is now, the ball is now in the Maharal's court. Now the problem is the Maharal. The problem is not the Rambam. You say, okay, Maharal, God is absolutely simple. So then, how can he know? Right? He's absolutely simple. His knowledge is not one with his essence. Right? He is totally beyond knowledge of the world, says the Maharal. So then what, you're going to say God doesn't know the world? Or how can the sages more correct in the Torah tradition, the way you would ask this question in a Torah way, because the Maharal would say it doesn't. You could just say, because you can always say just okay, it doesn't make sense to me. That's always an answer, right? So the correct question to ask is not that doesn't make any sense, because there's many things that don't make sense to us, and that's no proof of anything. Even the Rambam would agree. The real question to ask is, but the sages say that God is wise. What do the sages mean when they say God is a chacham? When the Torah describes God and describes God in all of these terms, right? God's will, God's wisdom, and all of these things. How can it be? God himself is utterly transcendent of these things, right? To this, Kabbalah has an answer that is very subtle and complex, which we've been discussing at great length, and which requires a lot of explanation. It requires a lot of chewing and turning it over to really begin to get it even a little bit. Kabbalah's answer is that it is a misjudgment to say that there is only God and the creation, as philosophy concluded. Philosophy concludes there is only God and the creation. The knowledge of God is just God. And then there's the creation of which he has knowledge. The Kabbalah says that there's three things. There's God, or three realms, so to speak. There's God, who's not a realm, he's God. Then there is the creation, there's what God creates. And then there's something called Elokus. There's something called godliness. There's something which is neither a creation nor the creator. It is an expression of him, and it has many names. Right? It's called his speech. It's called his it's called his light, his radiance, right? The infinite light, many different names for the same idea, which is all over Kabbalah. And the reason why it's important, the reason why, so to speak, it's all over Kabbalah, the reason why so much depends on this light, is because in the Kabbalah understanding, in which God is totally undefined in any terms at all, not even in the Rambam's very refined terms, which if you really learn to the extent to which the Rambam says God is not defined, it's a very high extent, and Kabbalah exceeds, the Maharal has problems even with that. That God is totally undefined except in terms of himself, in any way at all, even negatively, which is a very difficult concept. So how can God interact with the world and know the world, and perhaps even create the world is perhaps also a question, if that's something that can be understood. How do all of these things happen? And Kabbalah has an answer to this question. The answer is, they happen through godliness. They happen through his light. The light is an infinite expression of God himself and all that he is. Then there is a tzimtzum, a contraction, a limitation. And the contraction, the limitation creates something called vessels, which as far as our discourse is concerned are very mysterious. What they are, where they come from, their nature. The vessels are very interesting. But long story short, there's vessels. There's limited expressions of God. There's an infinite expression of godliness. There's a limited expression of godliness. And through this, the interaction and the unity of this infinite and this limited expression of the and the kli, of the light and the vessel, all of these manifestations of God are explained. We understand what all of them are. God himself acts and invests, so to speak, his light, his expression, in different things, in different vessels, and thereby he explains himself differently. This answers many questions. For example, it answers the question of why God has many names in the Torah. Right? You have Havaya and Elokim, very famously. You have God's 4-letter name, the Tetragrammaton, and you have the name Elokim, which is the first name of God used in the Torah. Right? In the beginning, Elokim created the heavens and the earth. Right? You have many different names of God, many different ways of God expressing himself. All of this, it's explained in Kabbalah, and then in Chassidus, is all has to do with him expressing his light through different vessels, through different modes. And the thing about this light, as we explained famously, as we spent time on in one of the previous discourses, is that it is an expression of everything that he is, but it is not an active expression. It's like the automatic. It's automatic, but also willful at the same time. Right? This is part of what we can't grasp about it. This is part of what's beyond human understanding. He radiates this light and expresses himself in a way that he does not change. He is not invested in the light. It's as if the light comes from him in an automatic fashion, as if the light, so to speak, this expression just happens. Right? The way the sun radiates light was our metaphor. But in our world, if that takes place, then the expression is not willful, it's not controlled, it's just automatic. It's by nature, so to speak. But God doesn't have a nature, at least not in that sense. Therefore, by God, this automatic expression is itself willful. This automatic expression is what God chooses. God chooses to express himself in an automatic expression, which in this world is a contradiction. But as we explained, and beautifully bringing in the Rambam's way of thinking again, this is a human limitation. Right? This is a human hang-up. Why assume that God has this hang-up? Why say that God himself has a problem with this? So therefore, what does that accomplish? That he has an automatic expression that he chooses, an automatic yet willful expression of himself. What this accomplishes is that changes to the expression do not change God himself. Changes in his light, changes in his radiance. The fact that at one moment he's expressing himself through chesed, through kindness, and at the next moment he expresses himself through gvura, or vice versa, through severity, this is not a change which affects him himself, because the light is radiated automatically. It's not a change. It's not a change in the very being of God himself. It's not God himself who changes, because the light is expressed in such a way, and really, if you want to understand this, you have to learn more about light, and even then, I'm not sure how much you can understand it. But the light is expressed in a way that it's not an investment. He is not deciding, now chesed, now gvura, and the way a person would be invested in it. Rather, it is an automatic expression, but the automatic expression, the radiance of the light, which does not affect him and does not change him, is completely under his control and under his choice. Right? This is part of the paradox. This is part of the difficulty of what we're dealing with. But that is actually all just preface to what is actually a more basic and, so to speak, a lower down explanation, which is in our chapter. With all that preface to our chapter, now we can review our chapter, which with all of that should be relatively straightforward, right? We asked the question, how can it be that God's will changes? Yesterday, or today, unfortunately, God does not want the Beis HaMikdash to be standing. We ask God, change your will, change what you want, that the Beis HaMikdash should be standing now, in the manner of will, as we, with our caveat from the beginning, right? Not in what his deepest will is or what his true will is. We mean the simple, what is reality as it is now, right? As we know in Chassidus, right, the world has no staying power of its own. Everything is created at every moment. So whatever the reality is now, God is actively creating it at every moment from nothing. Creating and sustaining and giving it life. So this reality, that the Beis HaMikdash is not built, God is God's will at the moment. And we ask God, please change your will. Yehi ratzon, that you should have a different will tomorrow. Right? The famous question, philosophically, is how can it be that God changes his will? If God changes his will, then God changes. Right? Changes in God's a problem. Changes in God, multiplicity existing within time, a body and parts, and the first cause and the second cause, and what's the whole, what's the ground, what's the part, right? All the problems come flooding back in. God's will can change. Yeah. God is supposed to totally transcend these things. He transcends change, he transcends parts, he transcends time. We even have a verse that says, Ani avaya lo shanisi, which in the Chassidic and Kabbalistic reading means that God, I God have not changed. right? I don't know about other readings. I'm not an expert. I should become one. I don't know about the simple reading of the verse does not, if I'm not mistaken, does not lend itself immediately to that conclusion, that it's saying that I, God, have not changed. It's saying something else, but that's okay.
No, but it has a continuation, not change, and will not change.
So, God himself does not change, and yet we ask him to change his will. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, the philosophers already answered this question. What's the answer of the philosophers? The answer of the philosophers is that you're making a mistake. You think that when we say God wills something, he wills it like a human being wills it. Right? You think that his will is like a human will. You think that when God desires one thing today and a different thing tomorrow, that implies a change in him. Right? That something is actually changing. But that is a human understanding of the will. In fact, what's the metaphor we bring? We say that to think that if you went and found God's will, it would look like a human will, or the opposite. If you were to think that a human will is the same type of thing as God's will, that's as intelligent as thinking that a letter that is written on a page, right? If you actually cut up the person's hand and then the person's brain, you will see a representation of that letter there, right? You will see the person wrote an aleph with their hand, so let's dissect their hand and find the aleph in the hand. Let's dissect their brain and find the aleph in the brain. These things, these forms are not in the physical vessels in which they're expressed, right? They're an expression of a deeper spiritual reality. The aleph that's on the board is not the same thing as the aleph that's in your mind. Your conception of the aleph in your mind is clearly of it, even though they both describe an aleph, it's of a different mahus, it's of a different whatness, it's of a different form, a different type of being than the aleph that's on the board. The aleph in your mind can never become physical. The aleph on the board can never become spiritual, right? They're connected because the physical has a spiritual aspect and the spiritual has a physical aspect, which is something else for a different time. They're connected. It is one does eventually reach and create the other, but to think that the physical expression or the physical form of the aleph is the very same being, is the very same type of thing as your conception of the aleph, your imagination of it, your imagination is the wrong word, your conception of it before you write it. This is a mistake. Obviously, you will not actually find the aleph as is written on the page in the person's brain or in the person's hand. It has a spiritual source. It has a source of a totally different sort. Similar, pardon?
I think it seems to be describing as a process.
It is a process, but the process goes from spiritual to physical, which makes it very hard to understand as a process. Because you're going from a spiritual conception of an aleph in the mind, in the koach ha-yediyah, right, or maybe the koach ha-dimyon, the mind's ability to know, or the mind's imaginative capacity, and you're bringing it into reality. The koach ha-metzayer, maybe that's in the mind as well, the ability to picture. I'm not sure exactly. I don't really understand necessarily all of the different descriptions of the different faculties, the different things the mind can do. I don't really understand all the fine gradations as much as I'd like to, but the bottom line is that you're not going to find the physical aleph in the person's if you cut up in the person's head, you're not going to find the physical representation of the aleph, and all the more so their hand. Yes. So it's a metaphor. The metaphor is that just as unlikely as you are to find the actual aleph in the person's head, is as unlikely as you are to find the human will in God's expression of will. Right? The human will and God's will, even though they both point to the same sort of thing. The person was thinking of an aleph and then they wrote an aleph. They seem to be pointing to the same sort of thing, right? They have the same thing as their object. I'm thinking of the aleph and then I'm writing the aleph. Right? Isn't it the same thing? It's the same thing, but also completely different. Right? The human will has many limitations that God's will does not have. To the extent that they are truly irrecognizable one from the other. You wouldn't even recognize it as will if you saw it. This is the philosopher's explanation, by the way. It's the philosopher's explanation with a Chassidic metaphor. Yeah, the philosopher's explanation is that why are you attributing to God's will the limitations of the human will? The way that a human being desires something is not a problem for God. God's will is not like our will. So when God desires one thing today and one thing tomorrow, the fact that this might imply a change in God is to say about God a limitation that we're only, as far as we know, is only existent in human beings. Why does that limitation have to apply to God? God's will is not our will. His will is totally one with his essence, just as his knowledge is, just as his thought is and his mind is, as we said before. And therefore, a change, which to us, when a change in will seems to apply a change in the person, this is all because of the limitations of the will as we understand it. God's will, which is totally not understandable at all, which is incomprehensible and beyond human comprehension, that will does not have that limitation, and therefore it's not a problem for God. The whole question in the first place doesn't start. The question is, given my human understanding of will, it seems that God would have to change. And the answer to the question is given your human understanding of will, okay, the understanding of the human will does not apply to God, really, in any real sense. Only the limitation, only our limited form of will is what we only understand our limited form of will. But none of these limitations apply to God, and we don't even really understand what it means for God to will something in the first place. Right? So therefore, what's the contradiction? What's the question you're asking? That's the philosopher's answer, so to speak. What we're calling the philosophers, which is really obviously only one specific opinion. The Tzemach Tzedek refers to them as the philosophers, so I don't know. Make of that what you will. The Tzemach Tzedek then makes a kal v'chemer. Tzemach Tzedek says, if that answer works, then all the more so this answer will work. Right? If what I just said makes sense, then all the more so we don't have a problem. If the philosophers can answer how, so to speak, asking God to change his will about the Beis HaMikdash is not a contradiction to God's unity and God's oneness and God's simplicity, then all the more so Chassidus doesn't have a problem. What's the all the more so? Because to the philosophical perspective, God and his will are one. God and his will are ultimately still of the same essence. So therefore, when you ask about a change in will, you're asking about a change in God in philosophical terms, right? There's no separating the two. God and his will simply are the same thing. There is no will of God as a separate faculty. There's just God. And the will of God is just one way of describing God. That's all it is. In Chassidus and Kabbalah, in the Maharal's approach, in the approach that uses Or, the approach that uses light and an expression of God, now there's no problem at all. There's even more not a problem. Because first of all, we don't understand God's will. The philosophers are right. But all the more so, we're not even talking about God himself. We're talking about his light. When you talk about God's will, you're not talking about God himself. It's not the same thing as God. It doesn't share an essence with God. When we say God's will, we do not mean God himself. We mean an expression of God. We mean a light of God. We mean a vessel. We mean a godliness, not the Creator himself. Gettlichkeit, and not Gott, as we would say in Yiddish. Right? Gettlichkeit, godliness, not the Creator himself, who is absolutely one in the Maharal's most strict of definitions. That's not what we're referring to, because that God doesn't have a will. That God is not defined in any terms, even in the Rambam's terms, even in the philosophical terms. So the will, when we say that God and his will are one, that means something very different to the Maharal, because to the Maharal, God forbid to say that God and his will are the same being. That's lowering God down. God is totally removed and totally undefined in any terms. Even to say that he has an infinite will that we don't understand, that has no limitations of human will, is to degrade God. God is God. Don't bring will into it. What is God's will? God's will is an expression of God, is an is a light, is a reflection, is an expression of God. It's not God himself. So therefore, Chassidus has even less of a problem, says the Tzemach Tzedek. Chassidus has even less of a problem with God's will. Because not only do we have the philosopher's answer, which is still true, we don't understand God's will, according to Chassidus. There's no reason to apply the limitations of our will to God's will. But even more so, this will isn't God himself anyway. So even if the will does change, even if the will were limited like a human will, it still wouldn't mean that God changes, because all that's changing is the light. All that's changing is the expression, which for the expression to change, God does not need to change. The expression changes, God does not change. God remains totally, quote-unquote, inert. God remains totally in absolute unity and in his oneness and does not act. and it's the light which changes. So therefore, for Chassidus, there's even less of a problem. Number one, there's philosophy's answer, which is still true, that we don't understand God's will. And number two, the only thing that's really changing is the light. And for this, we also gave a metaphor. Which I think we explained the last couple of weeks. Last week for sure. For this, we also gave a metaphor. We gave the metaphor of different types of handiwork that a person does, right? You have a person, you have one person who's very good at calligraphy, you have a different person that's good at weaving or woodworking or whatever it is, right? Different work with your hands. As we explained at great length, and we spent a lot of time on the metaphor, which is always dangerous because you have to remember it's just a metaphor, right? Even though the metaphors are true. The metaphor is also true, right? Depends whatever. The metaphors are also true. Metaphors are also true. The metaphors are not made up. The metaphors are also true, but the metaphors are true in as much as they are metaphors for the higher truth, something like that. All right. I guess I'll make pronouncements like that and not worry about it. So the metaphor is that a human being, a man of flesh and blood, does lots of different handiwork. But the thing is that the ability to do the handiwork is all connected to his mind. And the mind is one, ultimately, we said, right? In other words, it's not that when you do woodworking at one moment and then you switch to calligraphy, you have two different minds or two different intellects. This is not according to experience. A person has one mind, and the one mind is dealing with all sorts of different things, all different sorts of objects, all different sorts of handiwork. Then the question arises, but if it's only one mind, then why is it that one person is good at woodworking but bad at calligraphy, and another person is good at calligraphy and bad at woodworking, right? Vice versa. A person has different talents, and different people have different talents. Because if the mind is one, and you only have one mind, then from where does this difference arise, right? Because all you're doing is applying the mind to a different sort of challenge, right? A different sort of topic. You have spatial reasoning, right? You have aesthetics. I don't know how to do that. I'm making things up, but the mind is applied to different problems, different types of knowledge, different ways of knowing, right? You have a person who's good at shop class and bad at math. You have a person who's good at math and bad at shop class, right? Different people have different talents. So where do these talents come from? If it's just the mind, the way it should be is a person who's smarter is generally smarter. He's smart at everything. Well, why does the mind deal with different subjects differently? And the answer is because there is only one mind, but the mind deals with different topics and different things through what's called a levush, what's called a garment or an investment. There's a you can imagine it very physically, which is always the worst thing to do. But you can imagine that there's an interface module, right? It's modular. You have a calligraphy module. You have a woodworking module. You have a math module. The one mind invests itself in different things, and the thing is that it's the ability to invest itself properly that differs from one thing to another. Your mind has one standard capacity for thought and one standard strength and one ability to think, but the thing is that your ability to think may not apply as easily in all topics equally. It applies in this topic more easily because the levush, the ability to invest itself in this type of thinking is easier. It's not that the mind is weaker or stronger in different areas, it's that its ability to relate to that type of thinking is not as good. It can't invest
operating
itself.
System and different programs.
Yeah, modules. Yeah, same idea. You can't invest yourself as well in doing this sort of thing. Your way of thinking about this is less efficient or it's less good. Your mind doesn't invest in it as well. Right? This is the metaphor. What's the nimshal? What's it a metaphor for? Because God is absolutely one, right? There's not different ways there's not God forbid different gods or different powers, or The thing is that God relates, so to speak, to different modes of expression through different levushim, through different garments. And the thing about garments is that the garments can be switched, the garments can be changed, right? One moment the mind is invested in math, and then 2 seconds later it's invested in woodworking. And it switches over very easily from one thing to the other, and the mind itself in its essential capacities does not change. The mind does not change. What changes? What changes is that the nature that this thing I'm investing myself in demands, the sort of investiture of my mind that this thing demands has changed. And therefore, when I switch from woodworking to math, it's very difficult because I find math very difficult. My mind is of the same capacity. My mind is the same mind. My ability to invest myself in this thing is different. I have to put on a different type of thinking cap, and it may be better, it may be worse, whatever it is. There's a different way of investing myself. There's a different way of expressing myself according to the needs of this situation, even though my mind is one and stays the same. This is the metaphor. So too with God's will. When we say God's will changes, that now He wants there to not be a Beis HaMikdash, and tomorrow, God willing, He wants there to be a Beis HaMikdash, right? It's not that God Himself changes, because the will and God are not the same thing. The will and God are not the same being. There's God, which is like the mind in the metaphor. The mind itself, right? The central mind, the essence of the mind, so to speak, the core. And then there's its ability to invest itself in different things. So too, you have God Himself, and then you have His expression, you have His levushim, you have the garments, which can change. You have today He's invested in the garment of the Beis HaMikdash not being there, and then He'll switch that garment and He'll put on the garment of the Beis HaMikdash being there. He'll change to a different way of thinking, a different mode, a different type of thing, a different vessel, right? Different garment. It's a different way of expressing Himself, but He Himself does not change, right? And that's the idea. That's basically what we've said in this chapter so far, that he for the philosophers it's not a problem for his will to change, because they say He and His will are one, and who are you to imply limitations of human will on His will? And for us it's even less of a problem, because not only do we not understand His will, but His will is not one with Him. His will is just a levush. His will is just a garment. So for His will to change, He Himself does not change. Just like from the mind to change from one subject to the other, the essence of the mind, the core of the mind's ability to cogitate and to think remains unchanged. It's just the way, the external expression, the levush, the garment, those are what changes. So exactly as we said last time, just like taking off a red garment, which is gvura, and putting on a white garment, which is chesed, so too God changes His will. He is the same. It's the expression which changes. And then, one second.
Sorry.
Not yet. Questions at the end. We'll have a little time. One second, one last point here. I'll get it correct. Okay, I think that's it for the review.
But when you say you're comparing the will to tzurat hanagat, to the way of expressing itself. When you change the will, you don't express anything yet.
What do you mean?
Changing the will is not expressing anything. It's just an inside process that the results will make him do something, express himself. Changing the will not necessarily has a garment. I mean, the way we process things.
There's different. There's like 10 different ways to answer that question.
I see
what you're saying. It depends what you're saying, though. There's 10 different things you could be saying. Long story short.
All 10. I mean all 10.
You mean all 10 of them? First of all, we are talking about the will which has a garment. So it is more or less. Second of all, in a person, it's a limitation of the human will that our will and us are one. That we, in a human being, the essence and the will are very closely connected, such that the will can be described as what's called a hatayat haneshama, or hatayas haneshama in English, right? That the soul, the will is really just the soul itself turning in a different way, right? Which is why will is not one of the 10 spheres, because will is a koach klali. It's just the neshama itself moving, right? It's not one of the specific. It's not one of the. Obviously moving. The neshama moves. Okay, whatever.
No,
that itself is a. So there's all that. But that's not the core of the issue. I think the core of the issue of your question is that the idea that there's a difference between what God desires and what happens, which is not true. There's no unlike by a human being. It's another limitation of the will of the human being. The human being wills, and then the outcome is separate from the will. By God, there's no such thing. There's the will and there's the outcome, and they're one. There's no what's the way it's described is there's no potential by God. There's no potential for things happening. They either happen or they don't happen. There's no potentials is a big problem with God. In fact, if you go and read the Rambam, to bring our favorite philosopher back in,
the name Hatzul?
If you go back and you read the Rambam, you'll see that you can't ascribe potential to God. God is purely actual. There's no potential. There's no koach.
So you limit him.
What?
You limit him.
Well, anything is limiting him. Having a class is limiting him.
Listen, when we say Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor Vanora, Hagadol means potentially can expand anywhere. Hagibor means the zero Gibor Kovesh Yitzro.
When we say
limiting himself.
Potential means something else, but yeah. Potential is not how you're described. That's not what I meant by potential. But so what's your question? Tzur?
Yeah, what is Tzur?
I don't know. What is Tzur?
What is Even Tzur?
Yeah.
It's a rock that you create.
I can't answer
fire.
for everything you've ever read now. I don't know. I don't know what Even Tzur is.
No,
the Flintstone. Yeah. Right. What about the Flintstone? So, not the cartoon.
The Tzur, it means the fire is potentially inside him, even though it's not the
Yeah. So understand what the metaphors are for, which part of the metaphor is accurate. I don't know. I can't speak to Flintstones now. It's a whole other. Sorry. That's a whole other thing. I don't know.
But now, is the will a will, or is it a plan?
What do you mean?
Well, like we've been saying through the periods, he's willing something to happen, but it's really like a plan. So he's planned for the base of Mikdash to be built. No,
I said that specifically. I said that specifically not what we're talking about. We're specifically not talking about his deepest will, and obviously there's the foreknowledge of when the base of Mikdash will be rebuilt. These are all other issues. I'm talking about the practical, what you may call the active will. Maybe I just made that name up, but you could call it that. The active will for what is actually happening in the world right now. Everything is according to God's will. Anything happens in the world against God's will? No, nothing happens in the world that's against God's will. That's what we mean by will. You say the Beis HaMikdash is not here now. Tomorrow he'll want the will. The truth is there's much more to will and there's many levels, which as we're going to see as the chapter goes on, it's a lot more complicated. But this is until now, this is all the will you need. You need just the will. What is it that God wants to be the reality in the world at this moment, in as much as at this moment means anything to God, which itself is a reflection of the investment in the spheres, because the whole idea that the will changes from moment to moment is reflective of it being within the world and not within God, because God transcends time, right? It's the process of using the spheres itself creates time, right? Time as we know it in our world. So therefore his expression through the spheres is what even lets there be a distinction from moment to moment, and that his will changes from moment to moment, right? Which you may say even is perhaps the deepest expression of time, is the fact that his will can change from moment to moment. This is what creates time. Whatever. It's a whole. We'll get to time. I'm honest. We have a chapter on time, and that's going to be. We have a chapter on time, and it's going to be wild. I can just say.
So
long story short.
Hurry up and get to the end of the book so we can start again. We've got the whole picture.
That's right. We have to finish, so we have to get the whole. So we have parts. Right. Any other questions? All right.